So today I'm going to be bringing together everything that I've been discussing in these previous 7 lectures, and I'm going to show how this all um, magnificently portrays itself in the story of Christ. And so the first thing I want to do is I want to again recall to myself the previous 7 lectures for my sake, because one of the things that I'm doing with this course is I'm actually not um, just teaching you. I haven't memorized all this, and I don't know for certain that all of this is true. That's not the point of this course. I'm not teaching you. I'm trying to think through these things. And so in the first course, I established how human perception is relevant, the fact that it is the means by which we assign relevance to things. I talked about the frame of perception, what is, what could be, how, and then of course the manner in which, or the behaviors that transform one into the other. And I told you that that was a story, and that I think that is a story. The second lecture, we talked about the call of the hero, the humble beginnings, which is what we're going to talk about with Christ and the virgin birth. Um, then let's see, lecture three was into the desert. So that'd be something like Christ's death. Um, lecture four was hope and faith, if I remember correctly. And see, I can actually pull that up. Uh, let's see, lecture four was maintaining hope and faith while in the desert. Lecture five, I outlined the path of the hero and the adversary. Lecture six, I talked about returning home to the group. And last lecture, I brought all of that into something like a mythological framework, and I introduced this idea of God. And so this lecture is going to have 5 parts. The first part I've titled the necessity of sacrifice. We're going to talk about why it's important, the future reputation, future wealth, and God as the judge. Part two will be this is where we're going to get into Christ's story in the Gospels. I'm going to talk about the virgin birth, Mary and Joseph, God the Divine Father, uh, and the humble birth of Christ. Part three is going to be Christ's baptism and temptation in the desert. So we're going to talk about his baptism, his temptation, the ministry, and also the Pharisees, which will lead ultimately to part four, the death and resurrection of Christ. I'll talk about Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane, Christ and his relationship to the bronze serpent, his death, and his resurrection. Part five will be the application of all of this to our lives. I'll talk about the divinity of the individual, how we're all made in the image of God. I'll talk about the Logos. I'll again make reference to Christ's statement, I am with you always. And I will end off by talking about ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall set ye free. So, I want to start off by talking about sacrifice, because the story of Christ is the story of the ultimate sacrifice. So, um, firstly, you can imagine that there is something like a default condition, and that default condition is something like selfishness. Um, you can take there's a quite comical study that was done, or at least this is something that was practiced. You can capture a monkey in a quite funny way, and so here's how you can capture a monkey. You get a jar. You get a jar that is specifically, nearly the same size as the monkey's hand, and you have some candy inside of the jar, and you set it out, and then a monkey will come up and he'll stick his hand in the jar, and he'll hold on to the candy, but he can't pull it out because his fist has grown because it's holding the candy, and the only way for the monkey to take his hand out the jar would be to let go of that candy. And what you can do is you can walk up to the monkey and you can hold the monkey. And so the monkey is not willing to sacrifice the candy for his own life. And so he's actually still making a sacrifice. He's sacrificing himself, but he's making the wrong form of a sacrifice. He's making one that is aimed at the short term and not one that's aimed at the long term. And so you can imagine the same thing in early human beings, evolutionarily speaking, as well as in other animals. And you can kind of understand this as the discovery of the future, that the future is something that you can sort of bargain with, and that's quite a strange idea, though I think it's remarkably true. And so, what does it mean to make a deal with the future? Well, it means that you make a sacrifice that's aimed at the future. So you can imagine that you have some food and you can say, "Well, right now I'm hungry and so I'm going to eat all this food." And if there's leftovers, then you might say, "Oh, I'm gonna eat this too," and you might eat the leftovers, and so you might eat more than you actually needed. But it was there, and so you said, "Well, why not take it?" And that's sort of a reasonable thing to ask. Um, but then there's like, well, what should I do with this leftover food? Well, maybe I should give it to other people. And so it's this idea of sharing with others. And children seem to not like this idea of sharing with others, but the thing about sharing is that it actually, you're not giving up what it is that you're sacrificing. I mean, you're giving it up in the short term, but in the future, people are going to recognize you as someone who's willing to share. And so if you share your toys with other children, then other children will recognize that. And in the future, they may, if they're particularly good people and if they've recognized the fact that you're a trustworthy person, then they'll be willing to share their toys with you. And so you can share your toys, and maybe there will come a time when you don't have any toys, or a better example is food. You share your food, and maybe there comes a time when you've run out of food. But because you've shared it, you can go to other people and you can say, you don't even have to say this, but hypothetically, you could go and say, "Hey, do you remember when I gave you all this food?" And they'll say yes. And then you can say, "Well, can I have some of your food?" And they'll probably say yes. And so even though you're making this sacrifice, you're actually not losing it. You're making this sacrifice so that you can have it again in the future, and maybe you can even have more in the future than what you originally sacrificed. And so that's the benefit of this. And what you're doing when you're sacrificing for the future is you're storing wealth in the future in the form of, or at least one form of that is reputation, right? So other people will recognize that you're not in everything for the short term. They'll recognize you as someone who's trustworthy, someone who's willing to make the proper sacrifice, and someone who's ultimately willing to share. And because of your character, other people who are particularly righteous, let's say, and who recognize that, will be willing to return the favor to you. And so there's this idea of future wealth, and there's also this idea of future debt, right? So if I were to give you something, um and you didn't immediately give me something back, it wasn't exactly an immediate trade, then in some manner or another, unless I tell you, "Hey, you don't have to repay me," you would owe me some form of debt, and vice versa. If you were to give me something and I weren't to give you something back, I would sort of see that as I have a little bit of a debt to repay to you. And so, making a sacrifice, I guess the best way that you could explain this to a child, for example, is that when you share something, you aren't giving it up, but you're storing it in the future, and so it's actually better to do that. Um, and so, in this manner, if you sacrifice to the future as if other people in the future are looking at you and your future self is looking at you, it's almost like there's this guy in the sky, right, that's watching it. It's almost like there's this judge, that's the father that's in the sky, that's watching over you and is keeping track of everything that you've been doing. And I think that really has some truth to it. Um, and it is like there's some judge in the sky, in this real sense, because when you sacrifice now for the future, not only are you giving are you helping other people now and in the future, but you're actually also helping your future self. And it's like the people are remembering that, and they're storing that in their heart, and so it is, in this weird sense, that it is as if there is some judge, some cosmic judge that writes down everything that you do, and that keeps track of everything that you've done, and that will either punish or reward you in the future. And so the idea of sacrifice, you cannot look at sacrifice from a short term perspective. You have to see it in the long term, and it means that you have to have a vision of something that's beyond your current desires. But I would say that that's even beyond you, right? Because you're not just sacrificing what you want now for your future self. You're sacrificing what you want now for other people to have that, what you sacrificed, that wealth that you gave them, and food or toys or whatever it may be. You sacrifice that and you store it in reputation. And I would say, not only would do you get that back in the future, but you get it back, and even more, right? Christ says in the Gospels that those who accept the word will bear fruit. So accepting the word, accepting the truth, is a sacrifice, right? Because you're sacrificing um, your current knowledge. That's what you're doing when you say this thing's true and I didn't know that before. You're saying what I knew previously was at least partly insufficient. And so you take off what's insufficient and you attach back on what is, and that's a sacrifice. But I would say that when you take something off and you put the truth back, that yes, you're sacrificing, but that sacrifice is an improvement, and it's better that you made that sacrifice than that you didn't. Not only because your future self is glad, but because it's your future self is more glad than you would have been if you would have eaten that food right then. And so that's the idea of sacrifice. So now I want to move on to the virgin birth, and so I'll go to I suppose the Gospel of Matthew. We can start with. I know the general outline of the story, but I'll have it open at least for reference. So I'd like to start off by talking about Mary and Joseph, and the town that Jesus was born in, Bethlehem, and even the town that Jesus stayed in. Um, these people, Mary and Joseph, were poor people. Um, they were poverty stricken. We see this, we see this in Christ's birth. He's born in a manger, and even I suppose the first thing that we can understand, and this goes along with the humility of Christ, is that Christ did not come, on a horse, but he came riding on a donkey, and he didn't come wearing, a purple cape and a crown, but he came wearing wearing ordinary clothes, and the crown he worn was a crown of thorns. It was a crown resembling sacrifice, not divinity, right? Sacrifice to what's lower, not being a symbol of his divine authority and his superiority over people. And so that's sort of the idea there with this hierarchy, right? You have a hierarchy of value, and you have a social hierarchy, and at the top is the king, or the king of kings, and at the bottom you have the slaves. And one of the things that you see in the story of Christ is you see that Christ washes the feet of his disciples. um and I believe I made reference to this, but I'll quickly bring it up again. Christ is at the top of the hierarchy, and yet he serves what's at the bottom, and that is what the divine, or the inherently good hierarchy is predicated upon. It isn't predicated upon superiority, it's predicated upon truth, and of the divinity of every single individual, and the ultimate worth of every individual. And so Christ came not with a sword, but he came with a towel, and he came to serve. Now, Christ does say that he came not to bring peace, but to bring a sword, and that is true, but it's a metaphor. He didn't come forcefully, and he didn't come with authority. He didn't come as the judge. That happens in Revelation. Instead, he came as the lowly baby lying in the manger. And so Mary and Joseph are ordinary people. They do not come from wealth. They're likely young, because I believe Jesus is their first child, because Mary and Joseph weren't married until after Mary became pregnant. And and so they're still figuring things out. Jesus is their first son. They don't have everything in order. They don't have their whole house in order. Their marriage hasn't even been established yet. And here comes the light of the world. And so one of the things that I'd also like to bring up, and this is in particular relation to a literal view of Christ's birth. Christ was born, at least traditionally, he was born on December 25th. That's Christmas Day. And I believe that the shortest day of the year, so the day in which there is the least amount of sunlight and the most amount of darkness, is December 22nd. And so when did Christ come? Well, so Christ is described as the light of the world, the light of men, and the light that shines upon the potential stumbling blocks and the ultimate pathway forward. And so that's Christ as the light of the world, right? He reveals the sins of the world, and then he shoulders those sins upon himself, and he walks uphill with them. Right. So that's the crucifixion. So Christ comes at the darkest time of the year, right? There's this pattern. The days are getting shorter, 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 shorter. It's like, oh no, is the light that makes the world intelligible, and that can, in theory, reveal the inherent goodness of the world, of the structure of reality, is that light that shines upon the straight and narrow path, and that allows for transformation, that is knowledge, and in the best possible sense, is that light going to disappear? That's right. That's the question of Christmas. Is the light going to disappear? And then you have Christ's birth, right? The light of the world incarnate. Right. Okay. The spirit of the light incarnate. That's Christ, at least partially. And so it's very important also the fact that Christ comes from a humble birth, because one of the things that Christ calls upon his disciples to do is to follow in his footsteps, to shoulder their own cross. And so, in order for all people to follow Christ, Christ's story has to be representative of all people, at least in theory. And so, at least partially. And I think the virgin birth, the lowly birth, the birth in the manger and not in the king's castle, on the bedroom, or whatever, and something more fit for a king, we see that Christ is born lowly. Right. And so what that means is, ultimately, no matter where you come from, you can adopt Christ's mode of being, right? So it's something like that. And then there's Bethlehem and there's Nazareth, and these are small towns, um, and so the whole birth is a lowly thing, right? A small town, unknown people who are in poverty give birth to the light of the world, to the savior that will redeem the world, the hero from seemingly nowhere. That's the story of Christ. Well, so there's also, and I think this is right here, the escape to Egypt. So there's King Herod, and so this is kind of the strange part of the Christmas story, and it's also, sort of the negative aspect of the story, where we see this King Herod, and he's jealous of Christ because Christ was said to have been born King of the Jews, and Herod says, "Well, I'm the King of the Jews, and so who is this king?" And so he goes and he tells the wise men to, I should mention the wise men, and he tells the wise men to go, and find the baby, and tell King Herod where he's at, so he can go and worship him, when in reality King Herod wanted to kill him. And so the wise men, these three wise men, right? They see the star in the sky, they see the light that's revealing Christ, and they are able to tell the signs of the season. They are able to, they're paying close enough attention that they can see what's changed and they can see what's being revealed. And because of that, they can discern, that something strange is happening, and they go and they inspect it. And so it's also this idea with, um, the three wise men. They're inspecting something. They're following the light. They're following the pathway to Christ, and they bring, I believe it's gold, myrrh, and frankincense is what they bring, and they come and they worship Christ. And so that's again, that's that pattern of paying very close attention. It's remarkably stated over and over and over again in the Bible that you should be paying very close attention, to everything. You should be paying close attention to what's changing, and the signs that are being manifest, so that you can, use the opportunities that are being presented to you. That's a remarkably, commonly stated theme in the Bible. And so King Herod, going back to King Herod, he, then orders that all children under, the age of 2 are killed. And so um, this is the bad side of Christmas, and it's very odd that it's mentioned. But I think it goes along with this theme of Christmas being, in the winter, the cold, harsh winter, when things start to die off. And I think it's emblematic of the fact of when Christ was born. I mean, so in a yearly sense, we see that Christ is born when there's the most amount of darkness, let's say. Um, but there's also this video. I forget what the video was called. But it showed the worship of gods, and so what you see in this 70-year time frame, over the past few thousand years, um, we see in the 70-year time frame when Christ he's born in those 70 years. But in those 70 years, there's the least amount of worship, and so there's the most amount of spiritual poverty. So again, not this material wealth, but this spiritual wealth. Um, and there's the least amount of worship. You could say there's the least amount of well, yeah, there's the least of amount of spiritual aliveness, and that's when Christ makes himself manifest, and that's a very important motif. So, okay, now I'm going to move on to Christ's baptism and his temptation in the desert, his ministry, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the Pharisees, and that will lead us to the death and resurrection. So, Christ is baptized, which is quite strange, and so I'm going to speak a little bit about what it means to be baptized. Um, we see the the first reference to baptism might be later in the Bible, but we see, at least symbolically, we see the baptism of the world in Noah and the flood. And so, what's happening in that story is that the primordial waters are coming back and they're covering the world, they're destroying the world, and there's a microcosm, something still stays alive, and so that's the Garden of Eden, that's the tabernacle, that's the promised land. Um, it's the Ark of the Covenant. It's the dwelling place of God. It's the microcosm of the world in which things are holy, and so it's all those things stays alive and floats on top of the waters, and everything else is wiped away and destroyed and made anew. And so that's exactly it. That's exactly the idea of baptism. It's you're submerging yourself in the primordial waters of chaos, and that's doing away with all your insufficiencies, and the ark that floats on top is everything that's good, inherently good about you. And so you shed your deadwood, you cut off what's a hindrance to you, and so that's the idea of baptism. Now, I don't understand why Christ was baptized. I suppose it has something to do with this tradition, right? Christ, he does follow the tradition. I can't think of an example at this moment of a tradition that Christ followed. But he did follow tradition, but he didn't follow the commandments of men, so to speak, right? So he critiques the Pharisees. This is something we're about to talk about. He critiques the Pharisees for following the commandments of men and not following the commandments of God, right? And so I'm sure it has something to do with tradition. So that does with the baptism. The baptism is a micro narrative of the hero's journey itself, right? So it's a it's a physical manifestation of a psychological transformation. So now for Christ's temptation in the desert. Here we go. When Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil, after fasting 40 days and 40 nights, which is quite impressive, he was hungry. The tempter came to him and said, "If you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread." But Jesus answered, "It is written, man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God." So that's quite remarkable. I think that's a reference to Deuteronomy. Let's see. Deuteronomy 8:3 is what this says. Um, and so I suppose that it might not be exemplarily of Christ following the tradition, but Christ often reveals his mastery of the law and of the prophets of the Old Testament, essentially, right? Christ is a master of the Word of God made manifest in narrative and in, one could say, religious law. And so man shall not live on bread alone. Well, what Satan is tempting Christ to do is he's tempting to turn the stone into bread. So it's like Christ is being tempted to get what he doesn't deserve, right? And so he's saying, turn nothing into the food. If you are the Son of God, prove it, right? And so Satan is testing God, right? So then the devil took him to the holy city and had him stand on the highest place of the temple. And he said, "If you are the Son of God," he said, "throw yourself down, for it is written, He will command His angels concerning you, and they will lift you up in their hands, so that you will not strike your foot against a stone." But Jesus answered him, "It is also written, do not put the Lord your God to the test." Right, and so what the devil is tempting Christ with is to purposely sin, and then as you're falling say, "Oh God, please help me, don't let this terrible consequence happen to me." So effectively what he's saying is, go and purposely sin knowing that it's wrong and knowing that you're going to have a consequence, and then tell God and say, "Oh God, please save me. Oh no, this is so terrible." And so Christ says, do not put the Lord your God to the test. Again, the devil took him to a very high place and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. And he said, "All this I will give you if you will bow down and worship me." Jesus said to him, "Away from me, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only." Then the devil left him, and the angels came and attended him. And so this last temptation is to bow down to the usurping spirit, right? To bow down to the adversary and to fall down and worship him. And so effectively, Satan tempts Christ with the ability to rule the world through power, when the manner in which Christ became or manifested his kingship was through service, was through sacrifice, was through the death and resurrection. And so I like to talk a little bit about Christ's ministry and the Pharisees. So a little bit about the Pharisees. At one point I kind of had this idea, and I'm not so sure that it's true, but it seems to be something approximating the truth. And in the Old Testament, there is this idea of the Israelites as God's people and the Canaanites as God's enemies, and the Israelites and the Canaanites are enemies fighting and rebelling against each other. And so at one point I kind of had this idea that it was like the Israelites were Christ and his disciples and his followers, and the Pharisees are the Canaanites, right? And so you can kind of see that dynamic. I don't know if that's a good analogy, but you can kind of see this dynamic of Christ and the Pharisees, and their rivalry in a sense, in a sense a rivalry, but not necessarily. And so Christ usually, I guess you could say, sort of debates these Pharisees, and you can see how he's against them, and he even gets angry at them. But it's in the best possible sense, right? Christ, when he's angry at these Pharisees, he isn't, just trying to make fools of the Pharisees, and he isn't just trying to win an argument against them. That's not the purpose of this. The purpose is to transform the Pharisees and to lead them towards the straight and narrow path. And the Pharisees, they're the religious hypocrites, right? They're the ones that preach the law before, or maybe not even at all, before practicing it themselves. And so what Christ says, I think he says it right here actually. Matthew chapter 5, starting in 19. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches others to do accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commandments will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. So that's Matthew chapter 5, verse 19 through 20. Now, so that's the conflict between these Pharisees. And so Christ often he makes claims that are quite remarkable. There's even right here, Matthew chapter 5, verse 17. Don't think I've come to abolish the law and the prophets, And then you go over here to chapter 7 and verse 21. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. Verse 22, many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord. And then, of course, there's right after that, therefore, whoever hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is a wise man, and whoever doesn't is a foolish man. And then at the end, we see Matthew's remarks. When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching because he taught as one who had authority and not as their teachers of the law. And so it's made quite obvious. Christ makes it very obvious that he's not some ordinary teacher, that he's something like a Lord or a master. And so anyways, because of this, the Pharisees are angry at Christ because they think that he's committing blasphemy, and they plan to kill him. And so this is the death and resurrection of Christ. Okay, so now I want to talk about, here it is, so it's right here. Luckily, I found it. I'm not going to talk about the Last Supper today, but I'm going to skip ahead to the story of the Garden of Gethsemane. So this is Matthew 26, starting in verse 36. Then Jesus went with his disciples to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to them, sit here while I go over there and pray. He took Peter and 2 sons of Zebedee along with him, and he began to be sorrowful and troubled, right? So he knows that his death is near, and so he's sort of pondering that, and he's thinking about that, and he's accepting it. Then he said to them, my soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me. Going a little farther, he fell on his face to the ground and prayed, my Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me. Yet, not as I will, but as you will. So there's that willful acceptance, right? He's saying to God, his Father, if there's any other way, let it be that way. But if this is truly what must happen, I accept it. Right. So verse 42, he went away a second time and prayed, my Father, if it is not possible for this cup to be taken away, unless I drink it, may your will be done. Okay. So that's the prayers of Christ, right? So that's that willful acceptance of the cross. And so Christ, he also says something else that's I find quite interesting. Um, I don't remember where it is in the Gospels, but Christ says that he must be lifted up as was the bronze serpent in order that the people may be saved. And that's a very strange story. It's a very strange thing to say. So the bronze serpent refers to the book of Numbers. I can go to it real quick. Um, I believe it's Numbers chapter 22. And so let's see if I can find it. Moses, let's see. No, I think I got that wrong. Okay, well, so Moses, essentially God, gets angry at the Israelites because they're rebelling against God. So the Israelites, they're in the desert, right? They're on their way to the promised land, and there's no food and there's no water, or at least it's hard to come by. And because of that, they complain to God, and God gets fed up with it, and he sends a bunch of serpents to bite the Israelites. And after 3,000 of them die, the Israelites finally come and say, "Okay, okay, okay. We realize that we've sinned, and we repent, and so please go tell God to get rid of the snakes." So Moses goes to God, and God says, "I won't get rid of the snakes, but here's what I will do. I want you to take a staff, and I want you to put a bronze serpent around it." And so that bronze, it's actually the inversion of the golden calf that they worshipped in the book of Exodus. So whenever Moses came down with the Ten Commandments and he found them worshiping the golden calf as the God that took them out the land of Egypt, and he throws down the commandments and they break, and he has to go up and get a new pair, right? And so they broke the commandments morally and literally, I suppose. Um, and so it's the inversion of that also, but there's another element to it where they're gazing upon what's poisoning them, right? They're gazing upon the predator, right? The snake is the predator. It's chaos. It's the unknown manifested as predator. And in the case of a dragon, like in the book of Revelation, it's the ultimate predator that is subdued by Christ. So Christ says that he is the bronze serpent. And so in that sense, Christ is what must be gazed upon in order to be transformed. And right, and so that goes back to that idea of looking upon Christ, right? Not just accepting a religious axiom, not stating that you believe in God, but acting it out, right? Looking upon a manifestation of what you are called to do. And so if in order to move towards something, this is exposure therapy, right? If people are scared of something, what you do is you don't shield them from it, but you actually expose them to it more than before. And that allows you to overcome it, right? So gazing upon the crucified Christ allows you to at least psychologically accept that as your end as well. So let's see, there's Pontius Pilate's quite an interesting character. So he's like the corrupt king that questions truth itself. Right, but he's also, he's not necessarily portrayed as an entirely one-sided individual. He isn't entirely evil or entirely good, right? He questions truth, but he also, right here, he says, in Matthew 27 verse 22, "What shall I do then with Jesus who is called the Messiah?" Pilate asked. They all answered, "Crucify him." And Pilate says, "Why? What crime has he committed?" asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, crucify him. And so he does hand Jesus over to the crowd, and so in that sense he sort of accepts the crowd. But he isn't exactly portrayed as someone entirely evil. Uh, yeah, at least not entirely. And so the soldiers place a crown of thorns on Jesus, and they mock him, they slap him, and they crucify him. And that is the demise that Christ accepted. And so the crucifixion of Christ is quite interesting, because you might say, well, what is the ultimate sacrifice? And it's a hard I don't want to say battle. It's a hard choice between the self and the son, right? And so that's why, for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only son is mentioned by Jesus. It isn't just Jesus's own acceptance, although it is that, but it's also the sacrifice of the Father, and it's also the sacrifice of Mary and even of Joseph, right? So they're all allowing this to happen, and Christ is willfully accepting it. And so it's the ultimate sacrifice. It's the ultimate sacrifice, because it's the sacrifice of God, it's the sacrifice of Mary, it's the sacrifice of Joseph, and it's also the sacrifice of Christ himself. And then we see Christ's resurrection, and so that's quite interesting. The resurrection is the reemergence out of the land of the dead, right? So Christ is willing to give up everything, and in so doing he does give up everything, and he attains it in a better way. That's the death and resurrection. So okay, so I'd like to end off with this. I'd like to bring, so I've so far what I've at least attempted to do is bring this biological reality into a psychological landscape, and then I brought that into a mythological landscape, and then I brought that to Christ, and now I want to sort of in a sense go full circle and bring this back to the individual level, and show you how it can be useful in your own life. And so Christ is portrayed as being divine ultimately, and yet every individual has a sense of divinity. So we see this in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 and verse 27. We see, let us make man in our own image, after our own likeness. Let them have dominion over the whole world. So God made mankind in his likeness. In the image of God created he him. Male and female he created him. So we see not only are all people, not just the king, created in God's image, but that isn't limited to just males. It's also males and females. So it's everybody is divine in essence. And so that's quite interesting of a proclamation, but it is a presupposition that our modern society is based upon. And when we act as if individuals are divine or sovereign, things seem to go better than before. And so this idea, this image of God, only 26 verses into the Bible, is, I believe, it's one of the reasons that slavery came to an end. So just a side note, right? People seem to think that slavery was allowed of by the Bible, and I would say no. Firstly, what you have to understand is that the laws about slavery were an improvement from the laws around them, right? You can't enslave your fellow Israelites, and you have to release them after 6 years of labor. And even in the New Testament, or maybe this is also in the Old Testament, you can't kill your slave, right? And so the slave, if you kill him, that's still murder. And so you might say, oh, okay, well, I can see how it's it's not that harsh, but why are there still laws that seem to allow slavery? But what you have to understand is that it is actually an improvement, and probably it is a major improvement from the laws around them. But this idea that all of mankind is made in God's image, is sovereign or divine in essence, is precondition for so much of our society. And so what that means is that we possess at least some, and some to a degree, of the characteristics of God. And so one of the characteristics I want to talk about is the logos, right? The transformative word. And I'll end off with, ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. So we are all made in the image of the embodiment of the transformative word, of the spirit of the transformative word. And so what that means is that in spirit inhibits us, not inhibits, it dwells within us, and it acts through us. And what that means fundamentally is that we have the inherent ability to transform the world. Now we can do that for good as we adopt the mode of being of the hero, but again, we can also do that in a negative sense, and we can destroy the world, right? And so to define good and evil, there is a definition of good in the Genesis creation account, and it's that which attains, sustains, and promotes the growth of life. So good makes life more abundant, and evil makes life less abundant, and it's a destroyer of life, right? And so we can transform the world for good or for evil. And lastly, ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall set ye free. And to know the truth, to learn the truth, is the process of transformation itself. And so it's another notion that if you follow in Christ's footsteps, you will be saved. So that's the hero's journey. Hopefully you enjoyed this series. I certainly enjoyed it. I've been able to think through a lot of this. I hope it has made. I hope all this information is relevant to you. I think it's relevant to you, and I think that if you accept all of this, that it will lead to a positive transformation in your life.